The war had lasted for 300 years, and the Valorian Collective was losing. High Counselor Thesara stood alone on the observation deck of the Grand Citadel, her forearms wrapped tightly around her frail body as she watched the sky burn above her world. The Kreth Dominion had come for them at last. She could see their warships through the clouds, thousands of dark shapes blocking out the light of the twin suns. And each one of those ships carried enough firepower to turn a city into ash. The Valorians had always been a peaceful species. Their biology made them incapable of true aggression. And for millions of years, this had been their greatest strength. They had built their civilization on art and music and science and philosophy. And they had survived through diplomacy and trade and the protection of stronger allies, but their allies were gone now. The Torvax Empire had fallen first, conquered by the Kreth 70 years ago. And the Tsars still remembered the screams that had echoed across the emergency channels as billions of Torvax were dragged to the Myofrages. The Sindari Federation had been next. Then the Oryx hegemony, then the crystalline mines of Sector 9 one by one. Every great power in the Galactic Council had been swallowed by the Kreth's endless hunger. And now the Valorians stood alone against an enemy they could not fight. High Counselor, a voice called from behind her. And the Zara turned to see her aide Korvash approaching with terror in his large silver eyes. The outer colonies have gone silent, and we believe the Kreth have begun harvesting operations. Harvesting, such a simple word for such horror. Kreth did not kill their enemies quickly. They took them alive and fed them into massive biological processing facilities where living beings were broken down and reconstructed into raw materials. For the Dominion's war machine, every soldier of the Kreth lost was replaced by the flesh of their victims. How long until they reached the homeworld? The Zara asked, and her voice did not shake even though her hearts were pounding with fear. 40 hours at most, Korvash replied. Our shields may hold for 6 hours after that. Perhaps 8 if we divert all power from non-essential systems. 48 hours in 48 hours. The Valorian species would cease to exist, and 12 billion souls would be fed to the Kreth's hungry Machinist Thesser closed her eyes and thought of her children and her grandchildren and all the generations that would never be born. She thought of the great libraries of Velaris that held the collected wisdom of 1,000,000 years. She thought of the gardens and the temples and the schools where young Valorians learned to create beauty in a universe that seemed determined to destroy it. All of it would be gone unless she did something. Forbiddens, Korvash, she said slowly. I need you to prepare a transmission on the ancient frequencies, aimed at Sector 7G. Her aide's eyes went wide with shock, and he took a step backward as if she had struck him. High Counselor, that sector is under quarantine by order of the Galactic Council. The species that lives there is considered too dangerous for contact. Surely you cannot mean to. I know exactly what I mean to do, Thesara interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now. The council is dead, Korvash. The Kreth have consumed them all, and their laws mean nothing to corpses. She turned back to the window and watched another Kreth warship descend through the atmosphere like a falling star. We have nothing left to lose. The humans of Sector 7G were a mystery to the galaxy. They had been discovered only 200 years ago, a young species that had barely learned to travel between stars, and the Galactic Council had immediately placed them under strict quarantine. The reports from the observation probes had been disturbing. The humans were violent beyond comprehension. They had fought wars among themselves that killed millions of their own kind, and they seemed incapable of existing without conflict. Their short lifespans made them reckless, and their strange biology made them resilient in ways that defied logic. They could survive injuries that would kill most species 3 times over. And they bred at a rate that terrified the Council's demographic analysts, but worst of all, they were unpredictable. Every model, every simulation, every attempt to understand their behavior had failed. The humans did things that made no logical sense. They sacrificed themselves for strangers. They fought against impossible odds. And they refused to accept defeat even when defeat was certain. The Council had decided that such a species was too dangerous to integrate into galactic civilization, better to leave them isolated in their little corner of space, contained and monitored until they inevitably destroyed themselves. That had been the plan, but the Council was gone now. And the Zara was desperate. The transmission room was cold and dark, filled with ancient equipment that had not been used in centuries. And the Zara's hands trembled as she activated the communication array. "This is madness," Corvash whispered from behind her. "Even if the humans receive our message, they are primitives. They have only 18 warships in their entire fleet. What could they possibly do against the Kreth Dominion?" "Probably nothing," Desara admitted. "But I would rather die hoping than die in silence." She took a deep breath and began to speak into the transmitter. "This message goes out to any species capable of receiving it, but especially to the beings of Sector 7G, the ones called humans." Her voice echoed through the empty room. "Carried by ancient technology toward the distant stars, we are the Valorian Collective, and we are dying. The Kreth Dominion has conquered our worlds and slaughtered our people. And within 2 days, they will reach our homeworld and destroy the last of our kind." She paused, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall from her silver eyes. "We know you may not hear this message. We know you may not care. We know that the galaxy has given you every reason to turn away and let us perish. But we have no one else to ask." The words came harder now, each one a struggle against pride and fear and the terrible weight of hope. "We cannot fight. We have never been able to fight. Our biology makes us peaceful, and our culture makes us gentle. And we know that makes us weak in the eyes of the universe." She thought of her grandchildren again, of their innocent faces and their bright futures that would never come. "But we do not want to die. We want to live. We want to see our children grow old. We want to create art and music and beauty for another 1,000,000 years. And if there is any species out there willing to help us survive, we beg you to come." The transmission ended, and the Sara slumped against the console. Exhausted and empty, she had done everything she could now. All that remained was to wait for death. 47 hours passed. The Kreth fleet drew closer with every minute, their ships filling the sky like a swarm of metal locusts. And the people of Velaris huddled in their homes and prayed to gods. They had stopped believing Inthasara had not slept. She had not eaten. She had simply stood at her window and watched the end approach with hollow eyes. Then the communication array screamed to life. Every screen in the Grand Citadel flickered, and a voice filled the air. A voice unlike anything the Sara had ever heard. Rough and confident and filled with something she could not name. "This is Admiral Helena Vance of the United Earth Navy. We received your transmission 46 hours ago, and we have been traveling at maximum speed ever since." The Sara's heart stopped beating. "We heard your call for help. We heard your desperation. We heard your fear. And we want you to know something very important." The voice paused, and when it continued, there was fire in every word. "You are not alone anymore. We are coming, all of us, every ship we have, every soldier we can spare. And we will not stop until your people are safe." Another pause. "Hold the line. Valorians, the humans are on their way." The transmission ended. The Sara stared at the silent screens with tears streaming down her face. And she did not know if she should feel hope or terror. The humans were coming. The quarantined primitives. The violent savages. The unpredictable monsters that the Council had feared so much. They had heard her desperate plea. And they had answered. She looked out at the Kreth warships darkening her sky, and for the first time in 300 years, she felt something other than despair. She felt the faintest spark of hope, and somewhere in the darkness of space, 18 human warships burned toward Velaris at speeds that should have torn them apart. Crewed by men and women who had never met a Valorian and never would meet most of them, but who had heard a stranger cry for help and had decided that was reason enough to fight. The humans were coming, and they had no intention of losing. Overlord Sirith had conquered 47 worlds in his long career, and he had never once felt fear. He stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Endless Hunger, surrounded by screens that showed him the positions of every ship in his armada, and he watched the tiny human fleet approach with something close to amusement-tating ships. The humans had sent 18 ships against his 4,000. His tactical officers had analyzed the approaching vessels, and their reports had been almost insulting in how little threat they presented. The human ships were small and ugly, blocky things covered in weapons that looked primitive compared to Kreth technology, and their shields registered as barely functional by Dominion standards. Overlord, his second-in-command, said with confusion in his voice, "The human vessels are not slowing down. They appear to be accelerating directly toward our formation." Sirith made a sound that might have been a laugh if his species had been capable of such things. "They are primitives," he said. "They do not understand what they face. Let them come closer before we destroy them. I want them to see the full size of our fleet before they die." The human ships continued their approach, growing larger on the sensors with every passing second, and Sirith felt a flicker of curiosity beneath his contempt. Had read the Council's reports on the humans before their pathetic civilization had been consumed by his forces. They were a young species, barely a few thousand years old, and they had spent most of that time killing each other in brutal wars over territory and resources and ideas. Their lifespans were laughably short, barely a century for even the healthiest individuals, and they reproduced with a speed that suggested they expected most of their offspring to die young. They were violent and irrational and completely unpredictable. The Council had quarantined them because they believed the humans might one day become a threat to galactic stability. Sirith thought the Council had been cowards. These humans were nothing but slightly more aggressive prey, animals that had stumbled upon technology they did not deserve, and they would be harvested just like all the others. "Overlord, we are receiving a transmission from the human fleet." "Put it through." The main screen flickered and a human face appeared, small and pale with strange dark eyes that seemed to look directly at Sirith despite the vast distance between them. "Attention, Kreth forces," the human said, and her voice was calm and cold. "You are engaged in hostile action against a species that has requested Earth's protection." Sirith leaned forward with interest, studying the creature that dared to address him. "You have one opportunity to withdraw from this system and release any Valorian prisoners you have taken," the human continued. "This is not a negotiation. This is not a request. This is your only warning." The transmission ended. Sirith stared at the blank screen for a long moment, and then he began to laugh, a harsh clicking sound that echoed through the command deck. "One warning," he repeated. 18 ships against 4,000, and they give us one warning." His officers joined in his laughter, though theirs was more nervous than amused. "Send 400 ships to intercept them," Sirith commanded. "I want the human vessels disabled and their crews captured alive. Their genetic material should prove interesting to our scientists." 400 Kreth warships broke formation and accelerated toward the human fleet, their weapons charging and their rare harvesting pods preparing for deployment. The humans did not change course. They did not slow down. They did not attempt to retreat or negotiate or surrender. They flew straight into the Kreth formation at maximum speed. And then everything changed. The lead human ship, a vessel called the Defiant, according to the identification beacon, opened fire while still at extreme range, and its weapons tore through a Kreth destroyer with terrifying ease. But that was not what shocked Cirith. What shocked him was what happened next. Defiant did not pull back to a safe distance like any rational vessel would do. Instead, it accelerated even faster and plunged directly into the middle of the Kreth formation, its weapons firing in every direction at once. The other human ships followed. They flew like creatures possessed, weaving between the Kreth vessels with impossible precision, taking hits that should have destroyed them and continuing to fight anyway. A human cruiser lost its engines to a direct hit and began to drift. But instead of surrendering or waiting for rescue, the crippled ship changed course and rammed directly into a Kreth carrier, detonating its reactor and taking the carrier with it. Another human ship was surrounded by 5 Kreth destroyers, its weapons depleted and its shields failing, and rather than allow itself to be captured, the crew triggered some kind of self-destruct that consumed all 6 vessels in a ball of nuclear fire. Cirith watched in growing horror as his 400 ships were torn apart by 18 humans who refused to fight by any rules he understood. The humans did not care about their own survival. They did not try to minimize their losses. They attacked with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if each Kreth ship they destroyed was revenge for some ancient wrong. 11 minutes after the battle began, it was over 394 Kreth warships were debris. The human fleet had lost 6 vessels, but the remaining 12 showed no signs of stopping. They reformed their formation and continued toward Velaris Prime as if nothing had happened. Cirith stood frozen at his command station, his 4 eyes wide with an emotion he had never experienced before: fear. "Overlord," his second-in-command said, and his voice was shaking. "What are your orders?" Cirith did not answer immediately. He was still staring at the sensor data, still trying to understand what he had just witnessed. 400 ships destroyed by 18. No species fought like that. No species sacrificed themselves so willingly. No species attacked with such complete disregard for their own existence. "Send 1,000 ships," he finally said, and his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. "And tell them to maintain distance while engaging. Do not let the humans get close." The 1,000 ships launched, but Cirith already knew it would not be enough. He had studied the Council's reports on humans and dismissed them as exaggeration. Inferno. He understood that the reports had been wrong. They had not exaggerated the danger, they had underestimated it. On the surface of Velaris Prime, High Counselor the Sara watched the battle through her sensors and wept with a mixture of terror and awe. Humans fought like nothing she had ever seen. They threw themselves at the Kreth with a ferocity that defied comprehension, and they died without hesitation to protect a species they had never met. She did not understand them. She could not understand them, but she was grateful beyond words that they had come. The second wave of Kreth ships met the human fleet at the edge of the system, and the battle was even more brutal than the first. The humans had learned from their initial engagement. They had adapted their tactics, and they exploited every weakness they had discovered in the Kreth formation ships that should have been destroyed. Continued fighting with sections of their hulls torn away. Pilots who should have been dead kept their vessels in the fight through sheer willpower, and when a human ship was finally disabled beyond repair, its crew would aim for the largest Kreth vessel they could reach and accelerate to maximum speed. The Kreth lost 700 ships in the second battle. The humans lost 48 vessels remained, battered and burning but still flying, and they continued toward Velaris Prime without pause. Overlord Cirith stared at his tactical display and felt something inside him break. He had conquered 47 worlds he had never lost a battle, and now he was being pushed back by 8 crippled ships, crewed by creatures who lived less than a century and fought like they had nothing to lose. What are they? His second-in-command whispered. Scythe did not have an answer, but he was beginning to understand why the Galactic Council had been so afraid of the humans. It was not their technology, it was not their numbers, it was something else entirely. Something that burned in their hearts and drove them to fight beyond all reason and logic. Humans were coming for Velaris Prime, and Sirith was no longer certain that his 4,000 ships would be enough to stop them. The human shuttle landed in the central plaza of the Grand Citadel, while Kreth bombardment shook the ground like an endless earthquake. High Counselor Thesara stood waiting with her advisors, her forearms clasped together to hide their trembling, and she watched as the shuttle's door opened with a hiss of compressed air. Admiral Helena Vance stepped out into the smoke-filled air of Velaris Prime. She was smaller than Thesara had expected, literally reaching the Valorian's thorax, with short gray hair and skin marked by scars that told stories of battles fought and survived, but her eyes were what caught Thesara's attention. They were dark and fierce and filled with a fire that seemed to burn from somewhere deep inside her soul. Behind the Admiral came a squad of human soldiers in heavy armor, their weapons raised and their movements precise as they scanned the surrounding buildings for threats. High Counselor Thesara, Vance said, and her voice was rough but warm. I apologize for taking so long to arrive. Thesara stared at the human woman in disbelief. You apologize? She repeated. You crossed half the galaxy in less than 2 days to answer a call for help from strangers, and you apologize for taking too long? Vance shrugged, a gesture that Thesara did not fully understand, but that seemed to convey something like embarrassment. We could have been faster if we had not stopped to pick up supplies. But I figured your people would need food and medical equipment as much as they needed guns. She gestured toward the shuttle, where human soldiers were already unloading crates of supplies and setting up what looked like a mobile medical station. Speaking of which, we should probably get your civilians somewhere safe. My tactical team estimates we had about 6 hours before the Kreth break through your orbital defenses and start landing ground forces. Thesara felt tears welling up in her silver eyes. Admiral Vance, I must ask you something that I do not understand. Vance turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised in question. Why did you come? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 300 years of isolation and fear. We have nothing to offer you, Thesara continued. We cannot fight, we cannot build weapons. We cannot even defend ourselves. We are useless as allies and worthless as trading partners. The Galactic Council quarantined your species and treated you like dangerous animals. So why would you risk your lives and your ships and your soldiers to save us? Admiral Vance was silent for a long moment around them. The ground shook as another Kreth bombardment struck the city, and in the distance, Thesara could hear the screams of her people as buildings collapsed and fire spread. Counselor, Vance finally said, can I tell you a story about my species? Thesara nodded, confused but curious. Humans have been fighting wars since before we learned to write, Vance began. We have killed each other over land and resources and religion and ideas. We have committed atrocities that would make the Kreth look merciful. And we have caused suffering on scales that still haunt us to this day. She paused, looking up at the burning sky with an expression that Thesara could not read. But somewhere along the way, in the middle of all that violence and cruelty, we developed something else. We developed the ability to care about strangers. She turned back to Thesara. When we see someone suffering, even someone we have never met, something inside us demands that we help them. It does not matter if they are from our country, or our species, or our world. If they are in pain, and we can do something about it, we feel obligated to try, a Kreth drop pod streaked across the sky and crashed somewhere in the distance. And Vance did not even flinch. "That is why we came," she said simply. "You called for help. You were suffering. And we could do something about it. That is all the reason we have ever needed." The Tsar struggled to comprehend what she was hearing. "But your soldiers will die," she said. "Your ships will be destroyed. Your people will never see their families again. And for what? For strangers who cannot even thank you properly." Vance smiled, and there was something ancient and sad in that smile. "Counselor, do you know what separates a good person from a bad one?" The Tsar shook her head. "A good person sees someone in need and helps them. A bad person sees someone in need and walks away. That is the only difference that has ever mattered." She drew a weapon from her belt, a strange device that hummed with energy, and checked its power levels with practiced ease. "Now, with your permission, I'm going to show the Kreth what happens when they threaten people under Earth's protection." The ground shook again, closer this time, and the Tsar could hear the distant sound of weapons fire. "Admiral," she said, "I do not know how to thank you." Vance looked at her with those fierce dark eyes and smiled. "You can thank me by surviving. Counselor, take your people to the underground shelters and wait for us to finish our work." She turned to her soldiers, and her voice became sharp and commanding. "All right, people. You know the mission. We hold this city until reinforcements arrive or until every last one of us is dead. There is no retreat. There is no surrender. There are 12 billion civilians counting on us, and I will not let them down." The soldiers responded with a sound that the Tsar did not understand. A unified shout that seemed to shake the air itself. "Ura!" Then they moved out, spreading through the city in teams of 4 and 6, setting up defensive positions and preparing for the ground invasion that both sides knew was coming. Thessera watched them go with wonder in her heart. These strange small creatures from a quarantined corner of the galaxy had crossed the stars to save her people. They asked for nothing in return, and they were prepared to die for strangers they had never met. She did not understand them. She was not sure she ever would, but as she led her advisors toward the underground shelters, she found herself hoping that the humans would survive what was coming. Not just for her people's sake, but because the universe needed more beings like Helena Vance in the streets of the capital city. The human soldiers worked with terrifying efficiency. They reinforced doorways and windows with materials from their shuttles. They set up automated defense turrets at key intersections. They handed out weapons to any Valorian brave enough to fight. And they patiently taught them how to aim and fire, even though the Valorian's hands shook with fear. Sergeant Marcus Chun was setting charges on a bridge when a young Valorian approached him. A child no more than 10 years old by human standards. "Why are you helping us?" the child asked, and the translator in Chun's helmet converted the words into English. Chun paused in his work and looked at the small alien with the large silver eyes. "Because someone asked us to," he said. "But you will die." "Maybe," Chun admitted. "But that is okay." The child tilted its head in confusion. "How can death be okay?" Chun thought about the question for a long moment. "There are things worth dying for," he finally said. "Protecting people who cannot protect themselves is one of them." He went back to setting his charges, and the child watched him with an expression of pure amazement. The humans were unlike anything the Valorians had ever encountered. They were loud and rough, and sometimes crude. They made jokes even as the world burned around them. They complained about the food and the weather and the equipment, but when the fighting started, they transformed into something else entirely. They became warriors in the truest sense of the word. As the first Kreth landing craft touched down in the outskirts of the city, the humans were waiting for them with weapons raised, with hearts full of fire and with absolutely no intention of letting the Kreth take a single Valorian life without a fight. The battle for Velaris Prime began on a Tuesday, and it did not end for 19 days. The Kreth came in waves. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers pouring down from the sky in drop pods and landing craft. Their twisted bodies armored in the harvested flesh of 100. Conquered species, they expected easy prey. They found humans instead. The first wave crashed into the outer districts of the capital city and was met by a wall of fire that turned the streets into killing fields. Admiral Vance had positioned her soldiers at every choke point and intersection, and they made the Kreth pay for every meter of ground in blood. Sergeant Chen held the eastern bridge for 6 hours with only 4 soldiers and 200 rounds of ammunition when the ammunition ran out. They fought with knives when the knives broke. They fought with pieces of rubble torn from the shattered buildings when Chen finally fell. He had killed 73 Kreth warriors and bought enough time for 3,000 Valorian civilians to reach the underground shelters. He was not the only hero that day. Stand Sarah Park led a squad of 12 into a Kreth command post and destroyed their communications array before being surrounded and overwhelmed. Private James Morrison carried a wounded Valorian child through 3 kilometers of enemy territory while bleeding from a wound that should have killed him. Corporal Elena Rodriguez held a defensive position for 18 hours without sleep, food, or relief, killing so many Kreth that their bodies formed a wall in front of her barricade. The humans died in the streets of Velaris Prime. They died in the fight in the alleys and the buildings and the tunnels beneath the city. They died defending strangers who could not fight for themselves, and they never stopped fighting. Overlord Sirith watched the battle from orbit and felt his contempt slowly transform into something else. His forces outnumbered the humans by more than 1,000 to 1. But the humans refused to acknowledge the mathematics of their situation. Every time he thought victory was certain, the humans would launch another desperate counterattack. Every time he believed their resistance was finally broken, they would emerge from the rubble with weapons blazing. On the 5th day, he sent 10,000 soldiers to overwhelm the human position at the central plaza. Only 2,000 returned on the 8th day. He deployed biological weapons designed to incapacitate organic targets. The humans put on gas masks and kept fighting. On the 12th day, he ordered a concentrated orbital bombardment that reduced an entire district to ash. The humans emerged from the underground shelters and retook the position within hours. What are these creatures? Sirith demanded of his advisors. How can they keep fighting when they have already lost? None of his advisors had an answer. They had conquered species that were stronger than humans, faster than humans, smarter than humans, but they had never faced anything like this relentless, irrational, impossible determination. Admiral Vance fought alongside her soldiers on the ground. Her uniform was torn and stained with blood that was mostly not her own, and she had not slept more than 2 hours at a time since the invasion began. She should have been dead a dozen times over. But somehow she kept going, kept fighting, kept inspiring her soldiers to do the impossible. On the 15th day, the communications array crackled to life with a message from space. Admiral Vance, this is Commodore Chun of the UEN Defiance. The 2nd and 3rd fleets have arrived in system. What are your orders? Vance was crouched behind a barricade made of Kreth corpses when she received the transmission, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel something other than exhaustion and rage relief. 100 ships had come, 300 ships, filled with fresh soldiers and supplies, and the fury of a species that did not take kindly to having its people threatened. Commodore, Vance said into her communicator, I want you to establish orbital superiority and begin ground support operations immediately. She paused and looked at the Kreth forces massing for another assault. "And tell the troops down here that the cavalry has arrived." A cheer went up from the human positions across the city, a sound that echoed through the smoke-filled streets and reached the ears of the Kreth, warriors waiting to attack for the first time in the battle. The Kreth hesitated. They had been told that the humans were a minor species, primitives who had stumbled upon space travel by accident. They had been told that 18 ships was all the humans could muster. They had been wrong in orbit. Commodore Chun led the human fleet in a devastating assault on the Kreth Armada. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Hundreds of ships clashing in the void while the planet burned below. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The humans fought with the same ferocity they had shown in every engagement, throwing themselves at the Kreth with complete disregard. For their own losses, they rammed disabled ships into enemy formations. They detonated reactors to take out clusters of Kreth vessels. They fought until their weapons were depleted, and then they fought some more within 12 hours. The Kreth orbital presence was shattered on the ground. The tide turned just as dramatically. Fresh troops poured down from the sky in dropships, and they hit the Kreth lines with the force of a hurricane. Tanks rolled through the streets, their cannons destroying Kreth positions that had seemed impregnable. Aircraft screamed overhead, raining fire on the enemy from above and through it all. Admiral Vance led from the front, her weapon never stopping, her voice never faltering. "Push them back," she screamed over the roar of battle. "Push them back to whatever hell they crawled out of." The Kreth began to retreat for the first time in 300 years. The forces of the Dominion were running away. Overlord Sirith watched from his flagship as his army collapsed and his fleet burned, and everything he had built fell apart around him. "This is impossible," he said to no one in particular. "This cannot be happening." But it was happening. The humans had done what no species in the galaxy had ever done before. They had broken the Kreth Dominion. The last Kreth forces fled Valoris Prime on the 19th day, and as their ships jumped to hyperspace, Admiral Vance stood in the ruins of the capital city and watched them go. He was exhausted beyond words. Her body was broken in a dozen places, and she had lost more friends in the past 3 weeks than she cared to count. But she was smiling because 12 billion Valorians were still alive, because a desperate message sent into the void had been answered, because humanity had proven once again that they would always answer. The Callahan touched her arm, and she turned to see High Counselor the Sara standing beside her, tears streaming from her silver eyes. "Thank you," the Sara whispered. "Thank you for saving my people." Vance looked at the alien woman and felt something warm kindle in her chest. "It was our honor," she said, and she meant every word. The Kreth Dominion fell in 8 months after the Battle of Valoris Prime. The humans did not stop. They pursued the Kreth across the galaxy, liberating world after world, freeing billions of captives from the bioforges, and systematically destroying every trace of the Dominion's power. It was not a war of conquest, it was a war of justice. Every species that the Kreth had enslaved was freed. Every world that the Kreth had occupied was liberated, and every Kreth warrior who surrendered was treated with a mercy that no one in the galaxy had expected. The humans did not take revenge for the deaths of their soldiers. They did not slaughter the Kreth civilians or destroy their homeworld. They simply dismantled the Dominion's military capacity and established a peacekeeping force to ensure that the Kreth would never threaten anyone again when it was over. The galaxy was changed forever. Word of what the humans had done spread across the stars like wildfire, carried by survivors and refugees and the descendants of species that had thought they were alone in their suffering. A signal had been sent into the darkness, and the humans had answered. A desperate plea for help had been heard, and the humans had come. Species that had hidden in fear for millennia began to emerge from their hiding places. Civilizations that had accepted extinction as inevitable found hope one by one. They reached out to the strange small beings from Sector 7G, the ones who had crossed the galaxy to save strangers and asked for nothing in return to humans. Welcomed them all. They established diplomatic relations with over 200 species in the first year alone. They shared technology and knowledge and resources without demanding payment. They built hospitals and schools and research facilities on worlds that had never known peace, and whenever a message came through on the emergency frequencies, whenever a species cried out for help against oppression or disaster or war, the humans answered always, without hesitation, without exception. Fleet Admiral Helena Vance stood on the observation deck of the UEN horizon and looked out at the assembled fleet, 1,000 ships from Earth, 500 ships from Velarus, 300 ships from the Torvax Republic, 200 ships from a dozen other species who had joined the new alliance. It was the largest gathering of vessels in galactic history, and it represented something that had never existed before. Unity. The ceremony was about to begin. The signing of the new compact that would formalize the alliance and establish a new framework for interstellar cooperation. Vance had been asked to speak, to represent humanity at this historic moment, and she had spent weeks trying to figure out what to say. A familiar presence appeared beside her, and she turned to see High Counselor the Sara approaching with her flowing robes and her silver eyes. "You seem troubled." "Admiral," the Sara said. Vance smiled. "Just nervous, Counselor. I have faced down Kreth warlords and orbital bombardments and 19 days of siege warfare, but public speaking still terrifies me." The Sara made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I find that difficult to believe." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the ships drift past the viewport. "Can I ask you something?" the Sara finally said. Vance nodded. "I have been thinking about our first conversation when you landed on Velarus Prime, and I still do not fully understand something about your species." "What is that?" The Sara turned to face the human woman directly. "You came to save us because we asked for help. You asked for nothing in return, and you sacrificed thousands of your own people to protect strangers. But why? What drives you to care so much about beings you have never met?" Vance considered the question carefully. "Counselor, humanity spent most of its history alone. We looked up at the stars and wondered if anyone was out there. We wondered if we mattered. We wondered if there was any purpose to our existence beyond survival." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "When we finally reached the stars and found other species, we realized something important. We realized that the universe is vast and cold and indifferent, and the only warmth in it comes from the beings who choose to care about each other." She turned to face the Sara. "We care about strangers because caring is what makes us human. It is not a weakness or a flaw. It is the best thing about us." The Sara was silent for a long moment. "I think I am beginning to understand," she finally said. "But I wonder if you truly know how remarkable your species is." Vance shrugged. "We are just people, Counselor, flawed and messy and often foolish. But we try to do the right thing when we can." "That," the Sara said, "is exactly what makes you remarkable." The ceremony began an hour later in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Horizon. Representatives from over 100 species filled the chamber, their various shapes and sizes and colors, creating a tapestry of diversity that would have been impossible to imagine just a year ago. Fleet Admiral Vance stood at the podium and looked out at the gathered delegates. She thought of Sergeant Chun, who had died holding a bridge so that strangers could live. She thought of Lieutenant Park and Private Morrison and Corporal Rodriguez and all the others who had given their lives on Velarus Prime. She thought of the message that had started it all, a desperate plea sent into the void by a species that had lost all hope, and she began to speak. "We are gathered here today to mark the beginning of something new, a partnership between species that were once strangers. An alliance built not on conquest or fear, but on the simple belief that we are stronger together than we are apart. She paused, letting her words settle over the assembly. The Creth Dominion believed that the strong had the right to prey on the weak. They believed that power was the only thing that mattered. And they nearly destroyed everything we hold dear. Her voice grew stronger, but they were wrong. Strength is not measured by how many worlds you conquer or how many enemies you destroy. It is measured by how you treat those who cannot fight back. She looked at the Sara, who was sitting in the front row with tears in her silver eyes. The Valorians sent a message into the darkness, asking for help from anyone who would listen. They did not know if anyone would answer. They did not know if anyone would care. But they hoped. She turned back to the assembly, and we answered. Not because we had anything to gain, not because we were obligated, but because hope deserves to be rewarded. She stepped back from the podium. That is the foundation of this alliance. That is the principle we will build our future upon. When someone cries out for help, we will answer, always, no matter the cost. No matter the odds. The chamber was silent then, one by one. The representatives began to rise. They stood in their places and offered gestures of respect in 100 different ways. Bowing and saluting and placing hands over hearts, Thessera rose last, and when she spoke, her voice carried throughout the chamber. On behalf of the Valorian collective and all the species gathered here today, one proposed that this alliance be named in honor of those who saved us. I propose we call ourselves the Terran Compact, in recognition of the planet that heard our cry and answered. The vote was unanimous, and, as the delegates filed out of the chamber to celebrate the birth of a new galactic order, Fleet Admiral Helena Vance remained at the viewport, looking out at the stars somewhere out there. More species were suffering somewhere out there. More voices were calling for help, and the humans would answer. They would always answer because that was who they were. Because that was what they did. Because in a vast and indifferent universe, the only thing that truly mattered was the choice to care, and humanity had made that choice a long time ago.